The phone call came at 2:47 a.m., shattering Elena Rossi's sleep and, unknowingly, the fragile peace she'd built over the past 3 years. Maya's voice trembled through the speaker, broken by sobs that made Elena's blood run cold. Her sister wasn't just scared. She was terrified in a way that Elena had never heard before, not even when their parents died. Between gasping breaths, Maya managed to choke out the words that would change everything. Men had come for her, dragged her from her apartment, and thrown her into the back of a black van. They were demanding $500,000 for a debt their father had left behind, a debt Elena had foolishly believed died with him. Maya had 48 hours before they sold her to people who dealt in flesh and despair. Then the line went dead. Elena's hands shook as she stared at her phone, her mind racing through impossible calculations. She was an art gallery curator who worked a second job waitressing on weekends just to keep their modest apartment. $500,000 might as well have been $500 million. She had no wealthy relatives, no trust fund, no assets worth more than her 10-year-old car. But as panic threatened to paralyze her, something harder crystallized in her chest. Maya was her responsibility, had been since their mother's funeral when Elena promised to always protect her baby sister. She'd moved heaven and earth to put Maya through college, to give her a chance at a normal life free from their father's shadow. She wasn't going to let loan sharks destroy that future. There had to be a way, even if it meant walking straight into hell itself. By dawn, Elena had made her decision. Everyone in the city knew the name Valenti. It was whispered in back alleys and shouted in courtrooms, printed in newspapers alongside words like alleged and suspected, though everyone knew the truth. The Valenti family controlled everything from the docks to the downtown political machine, and their reach extended into places the law couldn't or wouldn't touch. If her father had borrowed from loan sharks, those sharks ultimately answered to one man. Dante Valenti was 32 years old, and had turned his family's struggling criminal enterprise into an empire after his father's murder. They said he was brilliant, ruthless, and completely without mercy. They said he'd killed his first man at 19 and hadn't hesitated since. They also said he was the only person in the city who could make $500,000 in debt disappear with a single word. Elena spent the morning gathering every scrap of courage she possessed, then took the subway to Little Italy. Nate Oscura sat on a corner like a beautiful lie, all warm lighting and elegant stonework, its windows promising the kind of Italian cuisine that food critics raved about. It looked nothing like a den of criminals. She pushed through the heavy oak doors just after lunch service, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The hostess, a polished woman in black, smiled professionally and asked if she had a reservation. Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt as she announced loudly that she needed to see whoever ran this place, that she had business concerning the Valenti family, and she wasn't leaving until someone with actual authority spoke to her. The restaurant went quiet. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and the hostess's smile evaporated. Within seconds, 2 large men in expensive suits appeared at Elena's elbows, their grips firm but not yet painful as they suggested she come with them quietly. She didn't resist as they walked her through the restaurant, past the kitchen, and down a hallway that smelled of old wood and secrets. They stopped at a heavy door, knocked twice, and pushed her inside before closing it behind her with a definitive click. The office was surprisingly refined, all dark leather and older books, with a massive desk dominating the center. Behind that desk sat a man who made Elena forget how to breathe. Dante Valenti looked nothing like the monster she'd imagined. He was devastatingly handsome in a way that seemed almost cruel, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair pushed back from a face that could have been carved from marble. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, dark and assessing, intelligent in a way that suggested he could see straight through whatever facade she might try to present. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't smile or offer pleasantries. He simply stared at her with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run, then spoke in a voice that was surprisingly cultured. He asked what she thought she was doing, making a scene in his establishment. The word has carried weight, a casual acknowledgement of ownership that confirmed everything she'd suspected. Elena forced herself to meet those dark eyes and laid out her situation with as much strength as she could muster. She told him about Maya, about the debt, about the men who had her sister. She explained that she had no money, but she would do anything, absolutely anything, to save Maya's life. She expected mockery or dismissal. What she got instead was a slight tilt of his head and a statement that made her stomach drop. He already knew everything she just told him. He knew her full name, where she worked, where she lived, how much she had in her bank account. He knew her father's name was Vincent Rossi, and that Vincent hadn't just owed money when he died. He'd stolen from the Valenti family, taken something valuable, and then had the audacity to get himself killed in a car accident before he could return it or face consequences. The debt wasn't really about money, Dante explained with the same casual tone someone might use to discuss the weather. It was about respect, about the message it sent when someone could steal from the Valenti family and face no repercussions. Maya's situation was simply business, a way to recover what was owed and remind the city that debts always came due. Elena felt rage bubbling up through her fear. She argued that Maya was innocent, that punishing a 22-year-old college student for their dead father's crimes was barbaric and cowardly. She expected violence for the insult. Instead, something flickered in Dante's eyes that might have been amusement or respect. He agreed that Maya was innocent, which was precisely why he was willing to negotiate. Then Dante Valenti made an offer that stopped Elena's heart. He would release Maya immediately, forgive the entire debt, and ensure both sisters remained under his protection. But there was a price. Elena would marry him, not next month or next year, but within the week. Before she could process the absurdity, he continued explaining with the same businesslike efficiency. He needed a wife, someone respectable and clean, untouched by his world. His organization was transitioning, moving operations into legitimate territory, and he required the appearance of reformation. A cultured wife who ran in artistic circles, who had no criminal connections, would help smooth that transition. The marriage would be a 1-year contract. She would live in his home, play the devoted wife in public, and ask no questions about his business. After 12 months, she would receive a quiet divorce and $2 million to start whatever life she chose. Elena's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. People didn't propose marriage as business transactions in the 21st century, didn't trade human beings like commodities. But Dante's expression remained utterly serious, and she realized with creeping horror that he was completely sincere. She asked what would happen if she refused. His answer was simple and devastating. Maya would be sold by morning, and Elena would spend the rest of her life knowing she could have prevented it. The choice, he assured her, was entirely hers. He would never force her. But they both knew it wasn't really a choice at all. The silence stretched between them as Elena stared at this stranger who held her entire world in his hands. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to find another way, to refuse to let this criminal turn her into property. But Maya's terrified voice echoed in her memory, and she knew there was no other way. No bank would loan her that kind of money. No friend or colleague could help. This devil offering a devil's bargain was her only option. She asked for one condition before she agreed. Maya had to be released immediately and sent somewhere safe, somewhere the Valenti family and their world couldn't touch her. Dante considered this, then nodded slowly. He made a phone call right there, speaking rapid Italian that Elena couldn't follow, then informed her it was done. Maya would be picked up within the hour, placed on a plane to Portland, and set up in a secured apartment with a trust fund sufficient for her to finish school and start her life. Elena Rossi signed the marriage contract 20 minutes later, her hand trembling so badly that her signature barely looked like her own. Dante slid the papers into a folder with the same casual efficiency he might use for any business deal, then stood and extended his hand. When she took it, his grip was warm and firm, and she hated how steady it felt compared to her own shaking fingers. He told her someone would be in touch about the ceremony arrangements, that she should pack whatever she wanted from her apartment because she would be moving into his estate immediately after the wedding. Then he dismissed her with a slight nod, already turning his attention to other documents on his desk, as if he hadn't just purchased a human being. Elena walked out of that office, through the restaurant where people carefully avoided looking at her, and back into the sunlight of a world that suddenly felt alien. She just agreed to marry a mafia boss, to sell herself for a year to save her sister. As she stood on the sidewalk, trying to remember how to breathe, her phone buzzed. A text from Maya. "I'm safe. I love you. Thank you." Elena closed her eyes against the tears and wondered what kind of monster she just chained herself to, and whether she would survive the next 12 months with her soul intact. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon in a judge's chambers that smelled of old paper and broken promises. Elena wore a simple white dress she'd bought the day before from a department store, the price tag still leaving a ghost of adhesive on the fabric near her hip. Dante arrived in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, looking every inch the powerful businessman rather than the criminal everyone knew him to be. The only witness was Marco, Dante's consigliere, a broad-shouldered man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that catalogued everything. The judge, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to refuse whatever pressure had brought him here, rushed through the ceremony with mechanical efficiency. There were no personal vows, no reading of love poetry, no music. Just legal words binding her to a stranger. When the judge pronounced them married, Dante slid an enormous diamond ring onto her finger without ceremony, the weight of it foreign and heavy. There was no kiss. He simply signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, nodded to the judge, and guided Elena out with a hand at the small of her back that felt more like a claim than comfort. The drive to his estate took 40 minutes, winding out of the city and into countryside that Elena had never explored. The property revealed itself slowly, first a high stone wall, then iron gates that opened silently at their approach, finally a sprawling mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from Tuscany. The main house was all honey-colored stone and terracotta roofing, with gardens that rolled out in careful precision and a fountain in the circular driveway where water danced in the afternoon light. It was beautiful in a way that felt completely unreal, like a movie set rather than a place where actual people lived. Dante helped her from the car, his touch perfunctory, and introduced her to Rosa, the housekeeper, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and hands worn from years of work. Rosa welcomed her with genuine warmth that felt jarring against the cold transaction of everything else, showing her through rooms filled with priceless art and furniture that belonged in museums. Her quarters, as Rosa called them, occupied an entire wing of the second floor. The bedroom alone was larger than Elena's entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, a 4-poster bed that could sleep 4 people comfortably, and an attached bathroom done in marble and gold fixtures. Rosa explained that she had her own sitting room, a private study, and access to the library downstairs. Dante's rooms were in the opposite wing, Rosa added carefully, as if Elena might have worried about sleeping arrangements. They would share common spaces for meals and entertaining, but otherwise their lives would remain separate. It was exactly what the contract stipulated, yet hearing it stated so plainly made the loneliness of her situation crash over Elena like a wave. She thanked Rosa, waited until the door closed, then sat on the edge of that enormous bed and cried until she had nothing left. The first week passed in a strange haze of adjustment and rebellion. Dante expected her presence at dinner each evening, served in a formal dining room with a table long enough to seat 20 but set for only 2 at one end. They ate expensive food prepared by his private chef, navigating polite conversation that never touched anything real. He asked about her day, her comfort in the house, whether she needed anything. She answered in monosyllables, barely tasting the food that would have been a luxury in her previous life. On the third night, frustrated by the pretense, she asked him directly what he actually did, what crimes he committed that required cleaning up with a respectable wife. His answer was measured and unsurprising. He told her the contract specified she wouldn't ask about his business, and he intended to hold her to that agreement. She called him a coward for hiding behind paperwork. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes, but he simply dabbed his mouth with his napkin and changed the subject. Elena refused to be a docile trophy locked in a gilded cage. She began redecorating her wing without permission, replacing the heavy masculine furniture with lighter pieces she ordered online using the credit card he provided. When Dante commented on the changes, she reminded him that these were her quarters and she would arrange them as she pleased. She attended a dinner party he hosted for business associates, men in expensive suits who spoke in euphemisms and regarded her with barely concealed curiosity. Bored by their posturing and frustrated by her position, she interjected into a conversation about construction contracts, pointing out that the timeline they were discussing would violate city zoning ordinances for continuous noise. The table went silent. Dante's expression remained neutral, but she felt his anger radiating from across the table. Later, he told her quietly that she had nearly exposed an illegal operation and her cleverness, while impressive, could have gotten someone killed. She hadn't considered the real consequences of her defiance, and the realization sobered her. Their arguments became a regular feature of life in the estate, explosive confrontations that cleared the air like summer storms. One night, after he dismissed her opinion on something trivial, she accused him of being a monster who destroyed families for profit, who had no soul and no conscience. She expected him to lash out or retreat into cold silence. Instead, he set down his wine glass with controlled precision and told her about his father. Antonio Valenti had been killed when Dante was 14, murdered by a rival family in front of his wife and son. His mother, already fragile, had deteriorated rapidly, dying 2 years later of what doctors called heart failure, but what Dante knew was simply the inability to keep living in a world so cruel. He'd inherited the family business at 16, barely more than a child, and spent the next decade clawing his way to power to ensure no one could ever hurt him like that again. His voice never wavered during the telling, but Elena saw something raw in his eyes that made her chest ache. She found herself apologizing, the words awkward but sincere, and they sat in uncomfortable silence until he asked about her parents. Elena told him about her father's gambling addiction, the way it had consumed him and destroyed their family's finances. She described her mother's exhaustion, working 3 jobs to keep them afloat, and the car accident that had taken them both when she was 23. Maya had been 19, lost and grieving, and Elena had stepped into the role of parent overnight. She'd sacrificed her own dreams of graduate school and devoted herself to giving Maya the stability their parents never could. As she spoke, she realized they weren't as different as she thought. They were both people shaped by loss, trying to protect what little they had left. The recognition created something fragile between them, not quite friendship but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Small moments began to accumulate like sediment, building a foundation neither of them intended. Elena woke one night from a nightmare about Maya being taken, gasping and disoriented in the unfamiliar room. She found herself walking the estate's hallways, unable to settle, and discovered Dante in his study at 3 in the morning. He looked up from paperwork, took in her distress without comment, and simply gestured to the chair across from his desk. They sat in silence for an hour, him working while she gradually calmed, his presence somehow grounding rather than threatening. Another night, she brought him coffee after finding him there again, exhausted from days of managing some crisis she wasn't allowed to know about. He accepted it with surprise that suggested kindness wasn't something he encountered often. They began having real conversations during those late-night encounters, discussing books they'd read, music they loved, dreams they'd abandoned for survival. 3 months into their arrangement, everything changed. Elena was in the garden with Rosa, learning the names of plants she'd never encountered, when the shooting started. The sound of gunfire was unmistakable even to her untrained ears, sharp cracks that sent birds scattering from trees. Rosa grabbed her arm and ran toward the house, but they didn't make it. Men in dark clothes emerged from the tree line, weapons raised, and Elena found herself shoved behind a stone planter as bullets chipped away at marble and earth exploded around them. She heard shouting, more gunfire, then Dante's voice cutting through the chaos with commands in Italian. She peeked around the planter and saw him moving with lethal efficiency, shooting with a precision that spoke of extensive training. One of the attackers swung toward her, weapon rising, and she braced for impact. The bullet never came. Instead, she felt a burning line across her upper arm and registered that she'd been grazed rather than hit directly. The fight ended as quickly as it started, the attackers either dead or fled, and then Dante was there, pulling her up and examining her arm with hands that shook despite his controlled expression. His face had gone pale beneath his tan, his eyes wild in a way she'd never seen. He carried her into the house, shouting for Marco to call a doctor, and personally cleaned and bandaged her wound with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. She tried to tell him it was barely a scratch, that she was fine, but he wouldn't speak. When the doctor arrived and confirmed the injury was minor, requiring only antiseptic and bandaging, Dante finally seemed to breathe again. That night, he came to her room and asked if she was afraid of him now that she'd seen what his world really looked like. Elena considered lying, but there had been enough lies between them. She told him she was terrified, but not of him. Something shifted after that night, a wall crumbling that neither of them had consciously maintained. Dante began joining her for breakfast, a meal he'd previously skipped. They walked the estate grounds together in the evenings, his hand occasionally brushing hers as they discussed everything and nothing. He showed her his mother's garden, a private space he maintained himself, where roses grew in wild profusion among carefully tended herbs. She showed him her sketches, amateur drawings she'd done in college before practical concerns killed her artistic ambitions. The physical tension between them grew undeniable, every accidental touch electric, every prolonged glance heavy with possibility. They both felt it but neither acknowledged it, as if speaking the attraction aloud would shatter whatever fragile thing was growing between them. The breaking point came during a rainstorm that knocked out power across the estate. They were in the library, Elena reading while Dante worked on his laptop, when lightning struck close enough to rattle the windows and plunge them into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting strange shadows, and Dante made a comment about the generator. Elena laughed at something in his tone, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. They began talking about fears, silly childhood terrors, and somehow shifted to current fears. He admitted he was afraid of caring about someone again, of giving anyone the power to hurt him. She confessed she was afraid of disappearing into his world, of becoming someone she didn't recognize. The honesty felt dangerous and necessary, and when he crossed the space between them and kissed her, she didn't pull away. The kiss was nothing like the polite peck she'd imagined married people shared. It was desperate and hungry, months of tension finally finding release. Elena kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair as his arms banded around her waist. They made it to the couch before breaking apart, both breathing hard, and she saw her own desire reflected in his dark eyes. He asked if she was sure, giving her an out, but she pulled him back down. They made love there in the library with rain hammering against windows, and it was nothing like the cold transaction their marriage had been. It was intense and real, and when Elena woke the next morning in his bed with his arm around her waist, she realized with dawning horror that she was falling for the man she'd promised to hate. Elena spent the next weeks in a state of controlled panic, caught between the life she was building with Dante and the knowledge that it had an expiration date. 10 months had passed since their wedding, which meant only 2 remained on their contract. They'd fallen into a rhythm that felt dangerously domestic, sharing meals and conversations, sleeping in the same bed more nights than not, stealing moments of intimacy that felt nothing like a business arrangement. Dante had become someone she trusted, someone who made her laugh and challenged her thinking and touched her like she was precious. But he'd never actually said he loved her, never discussed what would happen when their year ended. She was terrified that she'd invented a connection that only existed in her own heart, that when the contract expired, he would hand her the divorce papers and $2 million without a second thought. She confided in Rosa during a morning in the kitchen, watching the older woman knead dough for bread. Rosa listened with the patience of someone who'd seen everything, then told Elena something that shifted her perspective. Dante had never brought a woman to the estate before her, never shared his personal space or his history. Rosa had worked for the Valenti family for 20 years, through Antonio's reign and into Dante's, and she'd watched the boy become a man who trusted no one and needed nothing. But Elena had changed something fundamental. Rosa had seen Dante smile more in the past 6 months than in the previous 6 years. Whatever had started as a contract had become something real, at least for him, even if he didn't know how to say it. The question, Rosa suggested gently, was whether Elena was brave enough to stay and fight for what they'd built, or whether she would run when the year ended and never know what might have been. Dante was fighting his own battles with feelings he'd spent years suppressing. He'd built his life on control and emotional distance, on the principle that caring made you vulnerable and vulnerability got you killed. Loving Elena violated every rule he'd lived by, yet he couldn't stop. She'd become essential to him in ways that terrified him. He caught himself thinking about her constantly, rearranging his schedule to maximize their time together, lying awake just to watch her sleep. His enemies had noticed the change, noticed that the ruthless Dante Valenti had developed a weakness wrapped in soft skin and fierce eyes. He'd increased security around the estate to levels that bordered on paranoia, but he knew it wasn't enough. As long as Elena was connected to him, she would be a target. The logical solution was to let her go when the contract ended, to send her away with enough money to build a life far from his world. But the thought of losing her created a hollowness in his chest that logic couldn't overcome. The crisis arrived with the same inevitability as a storm on the horizon. Vittorio Marchetti had been circling for months, a rival who'd built his own organization in the city's south side and wanted to expand into Valenti territory. He was younger than Dante, hungrier, and willing to use tactics that violated the traditional codes. Dante had been managing the situation carefully, unwilling to start a war that would draw federal attention, but Marchetti interpreted restraint as weakness. The message arrived via a burner phone left on Dante's car, a simple text with 3 attached photos. The first showed Maya leaving her apartment in Portland. The second showed her getting coffee at a cafe near campus. The third showed her bound and gagged in what looked like a warehouse, terror evident in her wide eyes. The accompanying message was equally simple: the girl for Elena, or Maya dies screaming. Dante's roar of rage brought Marco and 3 other men running to his office. He showed them the photos, already calculating attack vectors and extraction plans, but Marco's assessment was brutally honest. They didn't know where Marchetti was holding Maya, and the warehouse in the photo could be anywhere in a 50-mile radius. Searching would take time they didn't have, and any overt move would likely result in Maya's death before they found her. Marchetti wanted Elena specifically, wanted to hurt Dante where it would destroy him most completely. Marco suggested they consider negotiation, feeling out what terms Marchetti might actually accept, but Dante dismissed it immediately. He would burn the city to the ground before he let anyone take Elena. The problem was that Elena wouldn't give him that choice. She found out because she'd learned to read Dante's moods, recognized the controlled fury radiating from him when she entered his study that evening. She demanded to know what was wrong, and when he tried to deflect, she pushed harder. Finally, he showed her the photos, and Elena's world tilted. Maya was supposed to be safe, protected by distance and Dante's resources, but here she was, terrified and in danger again because Elena had dared to find happiness. The guilt was crushing, but beneath it ran a current of familiar determination. She knew exactly what Marchetti wanted, and she knew she would give it to him. When she told Dante she was going to trade herself for Maya, his refusal was immediate and absolute. He told her he wouldn't lose her, that he would find another way, that she needed to trust him. But Elena had been protecting her sister her entire adult life, and she couldn't stop now, not even for the man she loved. Their argument was explosive, both of them yelling with a desperation born of terror. Dante told her she was being foolish and suicidal, that Marchetti would kill her the moment he had her regardless of any deal. Elena shouted back that he didn't understand, that Maya was her responsibility, that she couldn't live with herself if her sister died because Elena had chosen her own happiness. Dante finally grabbed her shoulders and forced her to look at him, his voice breaking as he told her he loved her, that she'd become everything to him, and he couldn't survive losing her. The confession hung in the air between them, both shocking and overdue. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she told him she loved him too, desperately and completely. But that loving him didn't change who she was. She was someone who protected the people she cared about, even if it cost everything. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Elena made her choice when Dante finally fell asleep that night, exhausted from days of managing the crisis. She wrote him a letter explaining that she understood his anger but couldn't be someone who sacrificed family for safety. She told him that the past 10 months had been the best of her life, that he'd given her a home and love she'd never expected to find, and that she was sorry. She left the letter on his pillow, took the burner phone from his study, and contacted Marchetti directly. The man's voice was oily with satisfaction as he gave her instructions. She was to come alone to an address near the warehouse district, arrive before dawn, and tell no one. If Dante or any of his people showed up, Maya would die before they breached the door. Elena took one of the estate's cars, keys she'd seen hanging in the kitchen, and drove through the pre-dawn darkness with her heart in her throat. The address led her to an abandoned meatpacking plant, all rusted metal and broken windows, exactly the kind of place criminals used in movies. She parked and walked toward the entrance, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. Marchetti emerged from the shadows with 4 armed men, younger than Dante and handsome in a cruel way, his smile predatory. He circled her like a shark, commenting on what Dante saw in her, wondering if she was worth the trouble she'd cause. Then he had her bound and brought inside, where Maya was tied to a chair in the center of a vast, empty space. Her sister's face was bruised, her eyes red from crying, and the sob that escaped her when she saw Elena broke something in Elena's chest. Marchetti monologued like villains always did, explaining how he would use Elena to break Dante, how this was about respect and territory, how the great Dante Valenti would crumble when he lost everything he cared about. Elena listened while scanning for exits and weaknesses, her mind working through possibilities despite her fear. She almost missed the subtle sound of movement from the upper level, the faint scrape of boot on metal that Marchetti's men were too confident to notice. Then all hell broke loose. Windows exploded inward as Marco's team breached from multiple angles, gunfire erupting in a chaos of sound and smoke. Elena threw herself over Maya's chair, trying to shield her sister with her own body, while men shouted and bullets ricocheted off machinery. Through the smoke and confusion, she saw Dante, moving toward her with singular focus, his weapon raised. Marchetti saw him too and opened fire, forcing Dante behind cover. They exchanged shots while Marco's men engaged the others, and Elena realized she wasn't helpless. One of Marchetti's guards had fallen near her, his weapon skittering across the floor within reach. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and when Marchetti's lieutenant circled around to flank Dante, she didn't think. She just aimed and fired. The recoil surprised her, but the shot hit true, catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him away from Dante. It was enough. Dante finished Marchetti with 3 precise shots, then eliminated the lieutenant before turning to sweep the rest of the space. Within minutes, the shooting stopped, leaving only the ringing in Elena's ears and the smell of cordite. Dante ran to her, pulling her up and checking her frantically for injuries while Marco's men freed Maya and secured the area. Elena clung to him, shaking with adrenaline and relief, while Maya sobbed against her shoulder. They stood like that in the wreckage, 3 people bound by blood and choice, until Marco cleared his throat and suggested they needed to leave before police arrived. The ride back to the estate passed in a blur, Maya curled between them in the back seat, Dante's arm around Elena like he might never let go. Once they were safe behind the estate's walls, with Maya checked by a doctor and sleeping in a guest room, Elena and Dante finally had their reckoning. He told her what she'd done was reckless and terrifying, that watching her walk into danger had nearly killed him, but he understood why she'd done it. She was loyal and brave and stronger than anyone he'd ever known, and he loved those things about her even when they scared him. Then Dante told her about the choice he'd made in the weeks before Marchetti's move. He'd been working with federal authorities, providing information about other crime families in exchange for immunity and the dissolution of all his illegal operations. He was done with the violence and the constant looking over his shoulder, done building an empire on fear. He wanted to go legitimate completely, to become someone worthy of the life he wanted with her. The transition would take time and wouldn't be easy, but he was committed. He wanted a real future, one built on choice rather than contracts, if she would have him. Elena kissed him then, tasting salt from tears she didn't remember crying, and told him she'd already chosen him every day for months. The question was whether he would choose her beyond the expiration of their agreement. The 1-year anniversary of their contract wedding arrived on a Thursday, the same day of the week they'd married. Elena woke expecting Dante to present her with divorce papers and a cashier's check, the clean end to their arrangement. Instead, she found a note on his pillow asking her to meet him in the garden at sunset. She spent the day anxious and uncertain, until Rosa appeared with a garment bag and knowing smile. Inside was a dress, simple and elegant in cream silk, nothing like the department store white she'd worn a year ago. Rosa helped her into it, arranged her hair, and told her that some stories didn't end where they began. They transformed into something better. The garden had been transformed with thousands of white lights strung through the trees, candles lining the paths, and flowers everywhere. Marco stood near an arch of roses wearing an actual smile, and Maya was there in a bridesmaid's dress, healthy and whole and grinning through happy tears. But it was Dante who stole Elena's breath, standing under that arch in a dark suit with an expression that held everything he'd never been able to say. This wedding had vows they wrote themselves, promises about choosing each other freely and building something real. Dante's voice shook when he told her she taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that love was the bravest thing he'd ever done, and that he wanted forever if she'd give it to him. Elena promised him partnership and honesty, adventure and home, all the days they had left to make better than the ones that came before. When the officiant pronounced them married this time, Dante kissed her like he'd been waiting a year to do it properly, and maybe he had. They celebrated with the people who'd become family, Marco and Rosa and Maya, eating and dancing under stars that seemed brighter than usual. 1 year later, Elena stood in that same garden with Dante's hand on her growing belly, both of them having found the family they'd thought they'd lost forever. The art gallery she'd opened downtown was thriving, Dante's legitimate security consulting firm was successful, and Maya was finishing her degree with plans to join Elena's business. They'd built a life based on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than contracts, and it was more than either of them had dared to hope for when a desperate woman walked into a restaurant and demanded an audience with a monster who turned out to be just a man waiting for someone brave enough to save him. Ready for more passionate stories of love, sacrifice, and redemption? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale of hearts claimed and destinies rewritten. Drop a comment telling us which moment made your heart race. Was it Elena's fearless confrontation, Dante's shocking proposal, or the moment they chose forever? Share this story with someone who believes in the power of love to transform even the darkest hearts. Your next obsession is just one click away. ***.